you said he was canceled, but like he also took his canceling by the intellectual class and incorporated it into his philosophy and wrote about the way these people think, essentially.
His observation is that we need to view the intellectual class like we would view any special interest group with its own agenda. Their agenda is ideas and influence in political realm and academia and so forth. But they are just another special interest group, and they need to be viewed as such. And we don't view them skeptically enough. And this is something he gets at in Knowledge and Decisions, where he's building on Hayek's skepticism of intellectuals and how they can't know more than the collective body of a society, no matter how smart they are. Tom is sort of built on that Hayekian view that we need to be skeptical of intellectuals. In terms of being canceled, one of the patterns I discovered in researching the book, watching a lot of interviews that Tom had done over the decades, is that he would often be asked by the interviewer, how does it feel to go against the grain of so many blacks? And Tom would say, he'd correct the premise. He'd say, I don't go against the grain of most blacks. I go against the grain of black elites, black intellectuals. And he said, black intellectuals no more represent the average black person than white intellectuals represent the average white person. And you can't conflate the two. So a lot of these black elites, and you see this today, whether we're talking about something like school choice, which is supported by most blacks but opposed by black elites, whether we're talking about voter ID laws, which are supported by most blacks, opposed by black elites, racial preferences in college admissions are opposed by most blacks, supported by most black elites. So down the line, and critical race theory, which is basically a dressed up argument and fancy language for affirmative action in racial preferences. That's all really critical race theory is. And it's no surprise that a lot of black elites support it, because affirmative action, to the degree that it helps anyone, helps people that are already better off, even though it's sold in the name of helping the poor and the underclass and so forth. So black elites have long defended affirmative action. It helps them. And they've attacked Thomas Sowell for critiquing affirmative action and calling out the fact that it tends to help people who are already better off. So again, that's an example that Tom would use of these elites having their own agenda, and that we need to be very skeptical before we swallow what they're saying whole. And look at their credentials and ask no questions.
One of the criticisms in line with that, though, that Sowell frequently gets from black intellectuals and just intellectuals on the left is that the way that he talks about civil rights and race issues is, if not an apology for racism, but at least kind of dismissal or minimizing of the impact that America's racial history has had on black Americans and continues to have on black Americans. Is that a fair critique, or does it completely miss the base? Like, is he kind of just saying racism is not as bad as you say it is?
No, I think it's a willful distortion of what Sowell has been saying. And if you're on the left and refuse and believe that racism is a blanket explanation for disparities today, anyone who disagrees with you is painted as someone who is apologizing or minimizing the impact of racism. It's really an all or nothing attitude that the left has. Tom has said racism is one of many factors that can explain disparate outcomes among groups. And the other side is saying, no, racism is the factor And our goal should be to rid society of racism. And but for racism, we would not have these disparities that we see today. And then that's when Sowell's empiricism kicks in. And he says, well, let's put that to the test. Let's look at what was going on among blacks at a time when there was far more racism than there is today. Let's look at the black family formation back then. Let's look at the rate at which black incomes were growing, the rate at which black home ownership was growing, the rate at which blacks were increasing their years of education, both in absolute terms and relative to whites. Let's look at the rate at which blacks were entering the skilled professions during Jim Crow, when racism was legal and widespread. And then let's compare that to more recent times, when there's clearly less racism. If nothing else, legal segregation no longer exists. Tom just says, let's weigh the evidence. Let's look at the evidence. And because the other side is wedded to this narrative that everything we see today is a legacy of slavery and a legacy of Jim Crow, they have to ignore this earlier period that Tom would use to compare and contrast the effects of racism per se. And then Tom would even broaden it. He'd say, one way he's distinguished himself as a scholar is through his international comparisons. He doesn't just look at what's gone on here in America and only among blacks. He's looking at what's happened to other groups. Blacks are not the only groups who've been discriminated against, hated, disparaged in society. And what is the track record among other ethnic and minority groups who have been treated similarly or in similar ways at different periods of time? And what has been their impact? What has been the impact of that treatment on their economic advancement? And if you look at, Japanese experience in the U.S., the time when they couldn't own land in certain states, couldn't work in certain professions, were interned during World War II. Today, Japanese Americans out-earn white Americans and outperform white Americans academically, and have for decades. You could take the example of the ethnic Chinese in Southeast Asia. Again, a hated group, locked out of certain professions, certain schools, certain programs, yet again, outperform the majority population that discriminates against them to this day, outperforms them both academically and economically. You could look at the example, of course, Jews in any number of countries around the world down through the ages who have done this. And then Tom would say, again, if racism or discrimination is an all-purpose explanation, a satisfactory explanation for the outcomes we see among blacks today, how do you explain the experiences of these other groups? And if you don't like comparisons to other groups, immigrants, and think the black experience is unique, then he says, okay, then let's compare what was going on in Black America in previous generations versus what's going on today. So Tom approaches this empirically. I think the other side has not only personal agenda involved in what they're saying to cover themselves, but also is just simply ideologically wedded to a narrative that gives people emotional release and provides them with scapegoats. And Tom, I think, is looking at this more dispassionately, as is his wont when it comes to these topics. And I frankly prefer that. These are topics that need more light than heat, and Tom is about providing light.
Some people have argued to me that one of the problems with Sowell's work in this area is that for real racists, for people who are actually racists, who would prefer to blame the race for ills, Thomas Sowell provides them kind of cover, essentially, that he gives them the ability to, because he himself is an African-American economist, and so that gives them cover, but racists can use his work to be almost more effective racists, but underlying that they are just racists. Is that a critique that's even meaningful or valid, or is it just off base?
it's something he's experienced for a long time. I think it's a cop-out. I mean, the one of the earliest, one of the first times he experienced this was when he did pioneering research on race and IQ back in the 1970s. And Sowell's interest at the time was to take on the scholarship of a social scientist named Arthur Jensen, who had written that outcomes today are largely explained through genes, genetic, it's hereditary. And therefore, Jensen was arguing that, programs meant to address the achievement gap in schools, say like Head Start, Jensen said these are useless because this is genetic. And Sowell wanted to take that on. There were other people who just wanted to call Jensen names. Sowell didn't believe Jensen was correct, but he wanted to test what Jensen was saying. And he did. He collected tens of thousands of IQ scores from going back to World War I. And he noticed some things that really undermined Jensen's genetic explanation for differences in group outcomes. You had all Black schools outperforming all white schools on standardized tests. You had Black women overrepresented among all people with the highest IQs. You had Black orphans raised by white families with above average IQs, and on and on. There were just all of this ran against Jensen's genetic theory of achievement gaps and intelligence gaps and so forth. And the one other thing that he noticed, and this is something that the political scientist James Flynn would pick up later and become famous for the Flynn effect. Tom noticed that a group's IQ could rise in a few generations. In fact, it could rise more than the gap between groups, which again argued that something involving the environment was playing a bigger role than genetics, because genes don't work that fast within a generation or two. They don't adapt that fast. So Tom took this research he had done and presented it to Jensen and Jensen's supporters. And that's how he took on Jensen. And by the way, when Charles Murray did the same thing 2 decades later, Tom did the same thing to Charles Murray on the same grounds. He had done all this research decades earlier to address Jensen's claims. But Tom's argument, and I think it's an important one, is when it comes to things like intelligence and what racists say about Blacks, Tom says, you can't be afraid of what you might find. He said, I didn't know what I was going to find. I didn't think Jensen was right, but I wanted to be absolutely sure. And I wasn't afraid to find out. He thinks there were a number of Black academics that approached him when he was doing his research and urged him to stop for the reasons you just said. They were afraid of what he might find and how the racists would be able to use it. Tom was not fearful of what he might find. And he said, you know what, though? Even if I do find what they fear the most, what are we supposed to do? Hide it? Well, he says, if you want to help people, you need to know where they are. Wherever you want them to go, they need to get there from where they are, not where we're going to pretend they are. And if you get rid of tests, and we're still having this debate with SAT scores. People want to eliminate the SAT test because of the racial